I'd like to begin my presentation again, first and foremost, really thanking New York City's Hospital for Special Surgery, and selecting me as their keynote speaker for Social Work Month. It is a time where we as a professional group with various organizations in our broad range of work are able to really come together and acknowledge all that we do, as well as the spaces in which we can push for more, both in our profession and society. Echoing statements again, uh, thanking Nadia Murphy, Paige Karen, and Mary Rose Carey. This would not have been able to happen without you. Again, I really appreciate the recognition. Moments such as these really provide validation that everyone needs occasionally to let them know that they're doing a good job. And it means a lot that my career over 15 years is being acknowledged in that way. My presentation entitled The Immediate Impact of Art, Healing, and Music Magnifies Social Work Month and social work in general, which is to be expected for an event such as this, but I don't stay within the confines of our profession. Over the course of the next hour or so, there are a few points that I will touch on. First, an introduction is always necessary. Knowing my background a little more deeply allows you to have an idea of my work's foundation. There'll be a brief opportunity for participants to share out in the chat as well. Being in conversation with each other in that way will allow us to have, again, a better idea of who's interacting with, who I'll be interacting with, and also how I can speak to specific points in order to make certain parts of the presentation, the information in it, more relevant, interesting, and concrete. Additionally, sharing ideas also helps people commit them to memory. I opened the discussion with an examination of the psychological framework of radical healing and or overlay it onto various efforts led by social workers. A couple of them have been ultimately successful in past. One remains ongoing. Either way, they give an idea of how to apply the key points of radical healing's 5 components. After that, we shift to a conceptualization of music articulated by Susan Rogers. That is a listener profile. Though she's now a doctoral level scholar, she was Prince's sound engineer for almost a decade. She's worked with him on albums like Purple Rain, Around the World in a Day, and Sign of the Times. The value of her work is its ability to break down some things that most people are generally aware of, but doing it in an explicit and intellectual manner, given the space. I imagine most people will find it at least somewhat interesting. Each of these points can be used to better relate to clients and understand the components of music as well as the mechanisms that allow us to listen to it effectively. Excuse me. Then we get to interventions, practical strategies that combine the concept of radical healing with music that can be used to provide better care for those that we work with. And finally, the discussion, the what's next, is how I end. I want to be clear that this work is serious, and that's set forth by the various professional organizations that we work with. My presentation will hopefully provide some ways in which we can approach uh, our, our collective work with the ideas and ethics that many of the organizations share to substantively engage with social matters and connect with clients in a manner that allows more intimate care. Again, my background in academics. I'm professionally rooted now in social work, both meso and micro work. I work at the Chicago Children's Advocacy Center, where I largely focus on managing a network entitled Providing Access to Hope and Healing, with 31 different agencies dedicated to treating trauma in children across the city of Chicago. Additionally, I provide case management services to different clients as well. This is done through facilitating their needs on a waitlist, as well as running different psychoeducational groups for parents, children, and the like. My academic background is in sociology and African American studies. That's more of my first professional life. Um, Again, I ultimately went to leadership and social change to enact the abstract concepts that are always important. But I shifted out of grad school when I realized how abstract the ideas were. But time passes, things change, people change. I think the best way to merge those two worlds is enrolling in another PhD program, hopefully in social work, but that's more to come. The great Nadia Murphy spoke to my participation in Ubuntu in, a small correction, Champaign, Urbana, the town where the state's flagship Big Ten school, University of Illinois, is located. And that's where I really cut my teeth as a community organizer. My experiences have been broad, whether in high school, marching against gun violence, community college, working on Obama's 2012 campaign, but also for a little more than a decade now, facilitating, again, the educational series, working around police brutality, and now conducting grant funded educational programs. My professional affiliations aren't as deep, but they are diverse, and they include broadly appealing groups like the National Association of Social Workers and more specific cultural and racial groups. Both of these spaces are massive, so I'm not at a point within my career where I can comfortably say I'm in a leadership position. Again, I take the work seriously as well as the development that is required to lead it, but I am working to understand my place in it, which is at least as important when it comes to making change. In community therapy and private practice, these are 2 points on opposite ends of the spectrum. Again, my work on one end is for children who have been abused, sexually, physically exposed to, as well as exposed to domestic violence or gun violence in their community. And they are exclusively referred to our agency if their case has been processed by DCFS or the Chicago Police Department. In private practice at Remotions, we exclusively accept PPO insurance as opposed to Medicaid. And in that same vein, we are not free at the point of service. There is a copay and things of that nature. I think another point that sets me apart is what I call being a semi-professional music listener and also a former music columnist. In my free time, I listen to a lot of music across dozens of genres. According to my Spotify Wrapped over the past few years, I've listened to at least 7,000 songs, as many as about 10,000 songs per year. That puts me at the low end in the top 2% of music listeners, and on the high end in the top 0.1% of music listeners, according to Spotify. I would also like to take time to thank the giants who I stand on the shoulders of. First and foremost, Dr. Helen Neville, who saw in me in 2014 something worth, you know, developing after taking her psychology class, and then working around several other things over more than a decade now, whether it's starting with social justice youth development and civic engagement, now moving to perinatal mental health, community organizing, or when it calls for it, watching her dogs when she's out of town. Mr. Tim Dillinger, who is a music historian, and he does deep work. He consistently makes the effort to raise the voices of marginalized artists across gospel, R&B, and women's music, specifically between the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. And I would say he helped me survive my PhD program. Our weekly conversations, more than anything, helped shift how I look at music, not just as an album, a song, or a single, but the culture of music, the labels, the artists and their relationship to their labels, different session musicians, lyricists, songwriters, and that also informs how I look at music in a therapeutic context, just parsing apart the details in order to make something synergistic with the whole. Reverend Terence L. Thomas, a Black liberation theologian. I've known him for a few years as well. And he, despite being a pastor, has informed my views of the political dimensions of, of music. And I think that goes to his ability to combine Christianity, politics, and music as a way to bring people together, and then also enact the concept that faith without works is dead. And finally, the former diplomat Vernita Pearl Fort. She is a woman with a resume as long as my arm, who's been doing work around the globe for about 50 years. I don't know what to say about her. She's one of the most impressive human beings I've ever met, and I'll be talking about each of them briefly later. At this moment, however, I can say that over the 4 or 5 hours of interviews that I conducted, I will be creating a separate piece to fully honor the work that they've done. In this presentation, I'll be briefly discussing each, though. And a few guiding questions that I have for this presentation to really begin to get into it. What is radical healing? What is this framework that's been cited over 200 times within the past 5 years, which, as any researcher knows, is wildly impressive, specifically when you consider half of all peer-reviewed published scholarship is never cited? How is music listened to? How is it? What are the dimensions of it? And what are the various mechanisms in which it is processed by human beings? And finally, how can music be used with clients within the framework of radical healing? How can we discuss the expansion of mental health concepts and put it in conversation with something that cultures around the world have engaged with for thousands of years? But before I get into it, I would really appreciate it if a few of you shared a bit about yourself. Just broadly, before we get into a conversation about music, sharing something about music that you enjoy. What's a song, album, or artist that you've been jamming to lately? And so I can more effectively speak to what your interests are, what piqued your interest in this conversation. The second one's particularly important. The first one's just, something, a point of interest. And I would appreciate if Mary Rose would be able to field out some of the responses.
Absolutely. Please, anyone feel free to weigh in the chat, and I'll get that over to Alex.
Thank you. Thank you.
Sure.
To take a moment and share something about myself. An artist that I've been listening to quite often over the past few years is Hozier. He's one that, when I first engaged with his work, I honestly wasn't a big fan of it, but something that I will share as we get into presentation, deeper into the presentation, is that a lot of music speaks to your identity. And I suppose my identity has changed in the past 10 years because he's become my favorite artist. And I would argue, for me, one of the best living songwriters in the world today, at least, in pop music.
And I have a couple responses. I'll read them. And Daniel says, I let Apple Music make a favorites playlist, and it's often filled with 70s singer-songwriters and 90s indie bands. Great choices. Arlene shared an artist that she always listens to is Adele and also Michael Bublé. We
Mm.
had Elton John and Brandy Carlisle. And Nadia said, what has interested me? Ooh, this is a good question. What interested me that music has gotten me through some tough times, and she can attach every emotion to a particular song. She has also had clients express that music helps them manage stress and chronic pain. We have some votes for also Hosier, along with Allison
Hey,
Russell, Beyonce. We have two for Beyonce, Chapel Roan. Bernice says Beyonce Freedom. Um,
gotcha, gotcha.
Another vote for Beyonce. We have a Taylor Swift, Parcels.
Okay, okay. Um,
So I would
and
say a both diverse and popular selection showing up here.
gotcha, gotcha. Awesome. Um, where we might need to take a break in a few moments. However, we will keep going over the next few minutes as some things shift in my context. However, I am excited to get into the radical healing conceptual piece of the presentation.
Thanks
So,
everyone for your
yes, and thank you for sharing. Radical healing is a flexible psychological framework, and it was published in 2020 only coincidentally overlapping with several monumental and concurring crises at that time, namely on a national level, the George Floyd uprisings, and globally, the COVID-19 pandemic. These are things that happened to occur. Everyone who knows how to publish research knows that generally takes more than a year. So even under the best of circumstances, if this was started in January, probably the earliest won't be published until January 2021. So again, coincidentally. The basis of its development stems from the context of race in the United States, as well as its consequences for the well-being of people of color in the United States. It makes explicit references to the synthesis of various other works rooted in social justice and activism, specifically around education, and putting those things together, they are able to adequately expand how mental health is conceptualized. One of the big points in which this occurs is when you think of healing and coping. Comparing and contrasting these notions allows for some pretty deep analysis. Their articulation of coping is an approach focused exclusively on the individual rather than their broader context. I'm sure many social workers can relate to this idea. This includes cultural, communal, spiritual, and social dimensions of human life. Moving away from coping to healing within this framework allows for the consideration of those neglected dimensions of human life. There are several components of healing or radical healing, and they affect my full and part-time work. If I am working with a family that's seeking services and I'm trying to provide them, and I only learn after presenting them resources that they are undocumented, then I have to make space for the internal distress that causes them outside that 1 hour and consider the 167 other hours they spend outside of the center. If I'm working with a Black man in my private practice who has excelled in every conceivable part of his professional life, but remains closeted due to his inability to give himself permission to feel, then I have to make space for the ways in which Black boys are not given the language or permission to express themselves fully, as well as the stigma around queerness in the broader society and specifically the Black community. And by using the 5 components listed here, collectivism, critical consciousness, radical hope, strength and resistance, and cultural and authenticity and knowledge, a lot can be done. And by parsing these apart, you're able to get a whole greater than the sum of its parts. So this framework puts in context one's various levels of being, from personal identity to social positionality and beyond. It also makes sense of how different parts of oneself overlap. The most impactful piece being, for me, uh, the clinical practice, research, training, and advocacy, all of which will be discussed later in different parts of the presentation. And though I have training in techniques that examine a client's values, connect their different parts of themselves, or more closely connect the patterns of thoughts and behaviors that they have, this framework goes beyond with its 5 components. And those are, just a sentence for each. Collectivism, which allows you to envision a future alongside others. Critical consciousness, which is seen as a prerequisite for healing. Without an idea of what's around you, what you're facing, you won't really be able to reflect upon anything, whether personal or social. Radical hope is a desire to improve human existence, the idea that one's effort also will not be in vain. Strength and resistance, a point that centers using what's available to improve life in society. And finally, cultural authenticity, which provides the basis upon which to engage with others. The need for radical healing can be found in no short supply across American society. First, something many people have probably heard in the helping professions, regardless of the specific educational background they have, is that of the adverse childhood studies experience. These identify different areas of overwhelming experiences that children are exposed to. These include physical, emotional, or sexual abuse, physical or emotional neglect, parental mental illness, substance dependence, incarceration, parental separation, divorce, or domestic violence. The data is irrefutable. Again, ACEs are unfortunately common. 67% of Americans have at least one. Almost 13% of the population has four or more. Researchers also found that the higher one's ACE score, the poorer their health outcomes, mental health and otherwise. And this relates to life expectancy in some ways. It decreased for the first time in American history during the COVID-19 pandemic. And though it was due to a global health crisis, it has staggeringly increased in recent years, but significantly behind other Western countries. Social disintegration can be seen in you know, something you hear quite often, the male loneliness epidemic. Something you might not hear about is the decrease in the amount of union members there are in different parts of the labor force. The rate at which people reading newspapers has decreased, and various other dimensions of human connection across a population of about 300 million people, which creates an inability to relate to one another, and specifically access to quality healthcare, in my case, mental health care. I would like to even just speak to my experience as a Black clinician. The reason in which I became a mental health professional is because I needed mental health care. And while in an in-person session, I had a therapist fall asleep on me. In that moment, I knew I was never doing therapy again. And second, if he could have a job doing this, then I could have a job doing this. So combining those things, I developed myself into a mental health professional. And my goal is to always make sure people are uplifted and connected. Rapport given my entry point into this care is the most important part of a clinical relationship to me. And I always strive for that. And then as life expectancy has decreased, maternal mortality has increased in comparison to other developed nations. All of this could be engaged with through social work, and the goal is to center humanity while acknowledging positionality. It's hard sometimes working in clinical work where many of my families have to be there, where all of them were referred through DCFS and the Chicago Police Department. I have to be able to engage with the backgrounds of the population I serve. Sexual abuse, child abuse happens in every community. However, we know that it's disproportionately impacts communities of color, specifically due to how socioeconomic realities play out in the United States. And this can be hard. It is very hard. But, I have to be real about that. The history example of Japanese internment is relatively well known and thoroughly documented. However, if you consider the fact that social workers facilitated several aspects of its execution by registering, counseling, and administering services within the camps, how does that overlap and conflict with the conceptualization of NASW ethics? And how can I work with families knowing that a mistrust of these institutions, one which I am a part of, can be considered a healthy coping mechanism? And then also, again, keeping centered radical healing. Oppression causes material harm to the health and well-being of marginalized groups. Relating it again to the Chicago Children's Advocacy Center, we have seen a 30% decrease in attendance rates for services among the Latino population. This is this speaks very seriously to the atmosphere and sense of psychological safety in the city of Chicago, and I would imagine is reflected nationally. Sensational things like Dr. Phil doing ride-alongs with ICE in Chicago contribute to this. And a way that the agency is working to respond and uplift and protect our population is doing Know Your Rights sessions that are bilingual, English and Spanish, and sharing them digitally. We're making clear our policies on the relationship to ICE. I've spoken briefly with the social work community committee at HSS, and it seems very similar. Just you are only able to come in if you have a warrant or you have an appointment. Another place in which, area of interest and expertise of mine is African American studies. Uh, it has been picked up nationally, but the first place in which this attack occurred was in Florida. And this organization, which I am a part of, has responded by creating freedom schools across the nation in order to buttress the ability to continue to provide an accurate understanding of Black people in history. These are all great examples of radical healing because they represent a call to action. They represent the ability of various institutions and people within those institutions to speak to the needs of the people that they serve. Here is a key quotation from the initial paper. The concept of radical healing pushes us to think about how psychological healing needs to move beyond traditional notions of psychotherapy that focus on helping the individual cope with racism and toward dismantling systems that contribute to race-based trauma. Thus, radical healing acknowledges the pain of oppression while fostering hope for justice and freedom. Brianna French and colleagues. And this is exhibited again through other examples. These couple of examples really highlight the way in which we can use our professional positions to expand care and services for the clients that we serve, the populations that we serve, our patients, whatever the case may be. There are different ways to engage with this. I list some related to legislation, some related to artificial intelligence later. These first couple focus specifically on social work. The last few are creative ways in which to combine music and healing. But starting here, maternal health is again a pressing public issue. There are a lot of concerns that relate to this period in a woman's life. It includes things like depression, obsessive compulsion, or anxiety, which are completely legitimate when you consider the context of parenting in the United States. 1 in 8 women experience postpartum depression, and 1 in 6 women experience perinatal anxiety during this time. And the perinatal period includes the time before, during, and after a pregnancy. It's treatable if identified early, but if it's not caught, it can cause adverse effects on mothers, infants, and their families. Suicide being one of the leading cause of death of mothers during the perinatal period illustrates the gravity of the situation, but very few states examine this specific need. I'm proud to say that Illinois has the second lowest rate of postpartum depressive mental health symptoms among the 27 states in which data is available. The first lowest is Georgia, but they have the CDC, so we'll count that as a handicap. And the state of Illinois mandates mental health week, screening for mental well-being during the perinatal period. There are several laws that have been passed over almost 2 decades, and they include communication across different state agencies. Just to name a few, Illinois was the first state to enact a law that allows untreated or undiagnosed postpartum depression and anxiety orders related to pregnancy or childbirth to be used as a defense in criminal cases and as a factor in withholding or minimizing women's sentences after conviction. So again, just illustrating the need for mental health care. Mental distress is a significant concern in that postpartum period and can result in certain criminal acts and behaviors. Additionally, the Perinatal Mental Health Disorders Prevention and Treatment Act, which follows that, it was enacted in 2008 and amended a few times, lastly in 2018, strives to create a safety net by requiring several state agencies to develop and disseminate materials for women and their families to conduct assessments during this period in their life. So again, just a couple of examples of laws that are, related to practices and policies on the institutional and micro level, instituted at the macro level. Licensing is also something that's pretty progressive at this point in the nation and the world. It was started during the COVID-19 pandemic, and I commend the field, many different individuals and many different institutions picking this work up. It was led by the Association of Social Work Boards and revealed a stark disparity in first-time pass rates for those taking the LCSW exam. By race, white test takers had a pass rate of 82.5%. Asian test takers had a rate of 70%. Hispanics, 59.6%, and Black, 42.4%. It's been stated that in their analysis, the licensure process is subject to the many systemic factors affecting individuals, particularly those from historically marginalized communities. These systemic factors combined with implicit factors, such as stereotype threat, can affect test takers at any point along their personal and professional trajectory and culminate in passing or failing the exam. So there's been great progress on this area and radical suggestions and policy changes led by mainstream organizations. So first, the Association of Social Work Boards created specific training initiatives that will help early or mid-career social workers become better prepared for the exam. And something I would like to focus on for a moment is the Council of Social Work Education making radical calls for the halt to the use of the ASWB social work licensing exam until a comprehensive analysis could be developed to would could be conducted to develop evidence-based solutions to address identified inequities. And this, of course, includes reevaluating licensing requirements, recognizing graduates from accredited programs, and reexamining the interstate compact independent of ASWB's exam. For those who aren't aware, that speaks to reciprocity in legal terms for those who have LCSW or MSW degrees in the United States. And this gets at a concept of institutional inertia versus institutional agility when you consider NASW's opposition to these changes, which is quite startling to know that organization I pay dues to is in opposition to policies that would help me progress in my career. And it gives me pause and makes me think about how do I move forward in the field. But I can say that reforming this process has allowed for Illinois to more readily address the state and nation's mental health workforce shortage. A policy was passed in accordance with these suggestions, removing the LSW exam and providing an alternative to the LCSW exam. If you have an MSW in Illinois, you are able to apply simply for the LSW. For the LCSW, you still have the 3,000 required hours, and you have to take the test at least once. If you fail the test, you can attain your LCSW if you complete another 3,000 hours toward your career. And so, a quick breakout group. What interventions can you see within your professional career field in which you can make changes? Do you engage in these spaces consistently? And also, initially, to what extent do you even engage with these organizations? And please put those answers in the chat, and Mary Rose will field them. Yeah,
Nice.
just take a couple minutes.
So Nadia said aligning with a benefit of it, aligning with like-minded professionals to elicit change. Um,
Right.
and then for licensing requirements, CEUs.
Gotcha. Those are good spaces to begin.
Mhm.
Okay.
Engaging on social media with NASW, someone has answered.
And maybe taking just a little bit of time more, maybe 30 seconds.
Sure.
To what extent do individuals engage with their various professional organizations?
So I have someone, Teresa, saying yes, very consistently, in terms of networking with similar professionals in the NYC area, as well as participating in educational activities.
Gotcha, gotcha. Thank you. So that's the first portion, really getting into radical healing. And why it's important in relation to music is that it speaks a language therapists cannot speak. To quote Reverend Thomas, one of the people I referenced in the beginning, the bright melodies and sounds can calm our souls and make us feel heard. And historically, it's a central part of our cultural communication and history. When you think of epic poems like the Iliad or the Odyssey, and it's capable of connecting these broad feelings interpersonally, humanizing communities as a whole, and social uplift, where many social movements have songs tied to them. The listener profile gets at 7 different themes. I pull from a book called "This Is What It Sounds Like" that could probably be more aptly entitled "This Is What It Sounds Like to Me." There are several dimensions of the 7 dimensions of a musical profile. The first are aesthetic. These apply to all dimensions of art. Briefly, it's authenticity. It's a dance between, really having the technical piece down versus a emotional piece. Are you being real to yourself? Conversely, realism is more so what do you picture when you listen to music? Novelty is what's the combination between new and old. Think of it as kind of like Goldilocks. The musical aspects connect different parts of your brain networks. They each have a distinct neural pathway. And this is a fact that I think is very interesting from the text. In the final trimester of pregnancy, a fetus's auditory system has developed well enough that some muffled sounds are audible as the baby floats in its gestational soup. Brain development at this age is just complex enough to allow us to learn simple melodic phrasings, such as intonations, which is one reason why newborns prefer the familiar sound of their mother's voice over the sound of an unfamiliar voice. Once we enter the world of airborne sounds, the speech prosody of our family's native language influences how we hear and shortly thereafter, how we produce sound. A newborn's ability to initiate speech even by waking neighbors with a long drawn out why, is fundamentally linked to the human sense of melody. Put another way, babies cry in different accents, and they develop increasingly intricate cries over time. And this concept of sound and listening is connected to a potential client or patient's cultural and personal identities. Think of this as, generally the idea of African instrumental music sounding African and Indian music sounding Indian, as broad and potentially problematic as that may be. The music reflects the pattern of the speech of the people who make it. Again, it's not limited to that. People listen to all different types of music, which is how I enjoy a indie pop artist who makes Irish folk music. So I'm not limited to R&B. However, many of those things are my personal preference. And this type of idea, melody being a series of sounds with various tones, humans are unique in that we have a wide range of vocal expressions. And this speaks to the co-evolution of language and melody. These points are very similar when we think about them. And because melody and lyrics are processed through different systems, again, the idea of intonation, how things are emphasized, versus information, what is actually being said, really gets at the potential idea of I don't listen to lyrics because you don't have to listen to lyrics to enjoy the song. Again, kind of moving a bit faster. Lyrics are directly linked to our identity, and it gets at a psychological concept of self-congruity. Listeners basically prefer artists whose personas are assumed to match their own. And I think a lot of this can be found in, a recent blow up between Kendrick Lamar and Drake. I think more than anything, that's about personal identity rather than music. And on a scientifically neurological level, people do reject music that is in conflict with their self image. So, for instance, I know Hozier's second album, Wasteland Baby, from front to back. However, because of some of the metaphysical conclusions, I do bristle a bit at the song No Plan, which I love aesthetically, but lyrically, I could go without it. And this quotation again gets at the idea of not letting lyrics get in the way of the groove. It speaks to one of the songs that everybody knows, September by Earth, Wind, and Fire. And it's said by one of the co-writers, Ali Willis. And it goes, the kind of go-to phrase that Maurice White, one of the lead singers of Earth, Wind, and Fire, used in every song he wrote was Badia. So right from the beginning, he was singing Badia. Say, do you remember Badia? Dancing in September. And I said, we are going to change Badia to real words, right? And finally, when it was so obvious that he was not going to do it, I just said, what the does Badia mean? And he has essentially said, who the cares? I learned my greatest lesson ever in songwriting from him, which was never let the lyric get in the way of the groove. Another quick example of this would be Bill Withers, Ain't No Sunshine When She's Gone. This piece where he says, and I know 26 times in a row is an example of not letting the lyric get in the way of the groove. The I know was a placeholder, and he was going to come back and add lyrics to it. However, he chose not to because it sounded better as it was. Because there's an ad in the video, I will pass it. And one of the most interesting parts of this piece is how rhythm is essentially subjective. Pieces like a time signature, tempo, or lyrics are objective. However, how someone moves to a song is 100% on them. And it gets at the underlying beat or pulse in the music that someone might feel. It's 100% related to perception, and it's related to a concept called action simulation for auditory prediction, or ASAP. And it can be understood as the brain anticipating sounds based on sensory input and motor actions, basically trying to predict what happens, what a sound will be before the sound is actually heard. It's based on learned patterns and associations from one's own experience, and how you move is, quite literally a reflection of that. Timbre is another deeply subjective piece. It's how a song feels to you. And that gets at a lot of things that can't be easily explained besides personality. So this is another quote referencing a legendary singer. It's a conversation between Etta James and Sarah Vaughan about Aretha Franklin. It's from a piece writing about Aretha Franklin's life. Etta James once recalled listening to Franklin's version of Johnny Mercer and Hoagie Carmichael's standard Skylark. In the second verse, Franklin jumps an octave. I had to scratch my head and ask myself, how the did that do that? I remember running into Sarah Vaughan, who always intimidated me. Sarah said, have you ever heard of this Aretha Franklin girl? I said, you heard her do Skylark, didn't you? She said, yes, I did, and I'm never singing that song again. This gets at the idea that if someone performs a song so well, it becomes their song. People have said before that Luther Vandross covering your song is the best and worst thing that could happen to you, as one example, because several of his biggest songs are covers. Even if there's an ad, I would want to play these videos because it gets at how evocative different songs can be. Also, real quick, if someone could let me know if sound is being shared as well as audio.
I did not hear the sound from the ad.
Got you.
So
Well, I have to, I'll share these out separately.
great, thank you.
I apologize, but they're two very different songs about the same thing. And they evoke different ideas and different emotional states. One, the song is called Love is Blindness. The original version by U2, I construe as the aftermath of a breakup. And then the version by Jack White, a cover, is more so the chaos and turmoil one could feel while going through a difficult point in a relationship. And so this one I think is an interesting question and one of my favorites when we think about connecting with others more deeply, coping versus healing. How can you use this type of information around music, around healing to connect with others when we realize that a large part of it is our cultural background? When we realize that a large part of it is also separate from the people that we grew up with. How do you put those two things in conversation with each other as it relates to someone who might be saying in front of you at any given moment at work?
I think those are great questions, and I hope please all weigh in the chat, and I'm happy to share them. But I feel sort of compelled. I think it's just like any identity piece, right?
Right,
How I listen to this or what resonates for me musically. What does that say about me, and how is that the same or different with
right,
our client or our patient? Um, I think it's really powerful, and especially for people who are especially inclined or yeah, inclined towards music, I think it can be a really powerful identity piece and can really say a lot.
right, right.
Nadia weighed in. It can connect generations and different social groups. Yes, certainly if there's a shared dimension. And Daniel said, even if the music tastes are different, showing interest in someone's taste encourages them to share something important to them. That's great. Yeah, absolutely validating. Thank you.
Exactly.
And Amy, who works with kids, said definitely feel it can help connect with adolescents.
That's a good example. I don't listen to Rod Wave, but some of my younger clients do, and it expresses feelings that I didn't know teenagers had, at least not when I was growing up. And that's a starting point. Why does this resonate with you? So understanding this and the various levels of music help for people to develop that connection and engages in certain ways with a biopsychosocial model of, understanding life. And it makes space for the art and science of music. So transitioning to interventions, music can be seen as medicine, and it can be used as an expression of joy and other feelings that have been collectively and independently in cultures around the world and it captures several components around healing. One is an interesting app called Resonance RX. It's an FDA authorized digital health tool developed by Lucid Therapeutics, which has several different tools. But this one is specifically targeted toward older adults in early states of memory impairment. It uses auditory beat stimulation, as well as CBT-based podcasts, mindful meditations, and personalized artificially intelligent generated therapeutic music. Auditory beat stimulation is a therapeutic technique that really gets at specific sound frequencies that shift one's brain waves to different states. And so this synchronization of brain waves can elicit different feelings, whether it's alpha waves associated with relaxation and stress reduction, theta waves related to deep meditation and creativity, or delta waves, which are also considered um, relevant to deep sleep and restorative mental processes. Additionally, another piece would be autoimmune diseases. This is concerning because they have exponentially increased in recent decades, and they are disproportionately impacting women. Almost 100% of autoimmune diseases are contracted by women, and rheumatoid arthritis specifically impacts women at a rate 3 times greater than that of men. Decades of research reveal the connection between one's environment and also how people can cope with it. And so the difficulty with some of these diseases, specifically autoimmune, is that they're idiopathic and in some ways mysterious in terms of examining how they're contracted, but stress is a factor. Reading from one thinker, um, there is one quote that I would really like to pull from a book. The onset of the disease was often preceded by stress, as much and often preceded by stress. Frequently, as much time is needed for dealing with the emotional problems of the patient with chronic rheumatoid arthritis as with the joint or systemic disorders. I think the emotional and psychological aspects of rheumatoid patients is of first importance. And this comes from Dr. C.E.G. Robinson, which is a noted pathologist in this way. And so thinking about that is important in terms of treating the autoimmune disease. Music is one way to do it because a lack of expression and stress management, a deficit of stress management is a factor in the disease. Playing music has been able to develop a dexterity for those with arthritis, as well as listening to music in a way similar to products like Resonance RX suggest to shift stress levels in one's mind. There's also creative ways to use scholarship. There's a poem entitled Simply Being that was published in a journal article entitled Simply Being, a found poem for the trans community from trans mental health professionals and trainees. It works against the mental health field's contributions to and complicity in structural transphobia. And kind of like how I said in the beginning, our institutions are only as good as the people in them in terms of our ability to adhere to the ethics. Sometimes, again, it can be diagnosing homosexuality as a mental disorder. It can be diagnosing runaway slaves as having also a mental disorder and thrown in an asylum, or it can be repressive policies around transphobia. And this work again uses the tools of the field to intervene with intervene against or write against past oppressive practices in the trans non-binary community. And it's a way to co-create knowledge with those who are studying in that effort to better speak to their needs. You're allowing their words to be heard out. And this presents an interesting opportunity for scholars, artists, policymakers, and the like. The poem can be seen here. And again, in the interest of time, we can talk about it later. Um, in the interest of time, we will also talk about this later, but it gets at the idea of justice being therapeutic and justice being healing. It's the need to take into consideration the whole human being. And it's this TED talk is given by Dr. Tama Bryant, the president of the American Psychological Association, current or maybe past, I forget which, but the APA has a mixed history. You know, it can be pushing progressive policies related to justice, but there's also an example of, you know, creating torture programs for suspected terrorists in the early 2000s. So again, it is mixed, and we need to adhere to the ethics that our organizations have. Speaking specifically to social workers, we occupy a privileged position, as do all professionals. The NASW represents 100,000 out of the 800,000 social workers in the United States. This is an opportunity to lead path-breaking efforts or not, but it will require a paradigmatic shift. There are massive tasks that lay before us. This again references the people who have supported me in this effort. So Tim Dillinger's blog, God's Music is My Life, which speaks to expanding the idea of gospel music, which was initially rejected by the church, despite it later being used by the church. Reverend Thomas's political notions of pastoral care, or Vanita Pearl Fort's Music and Human Rights Project, which is now working to put on festivals in the Caribbean and also build the ability to shift the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. The idea that I would like to highlight most is that of joy. Working toward healing does not necessarily entail centering oppression. If we uplift the experience, the best of people's experiences, we can come up with progressive ways to expand humanity. We can, and I think it is important to, at certain points, really speak to oppressive forces, but we can also be productive positively at the same time. And there's multiple approaches toward that end. There are personal and collective healing strategies, and they build on various strengths and traditions developed over time. This will fuel vital sustaining forces for progress and ultimately aid in the struggle for and to ultimately realize justice. Thank you.
Alex, thank you so much. That was great, and I think so relevant to our practice and our work, and I really appreciate it. I am going to turn it over to Adina, who's going to facilitate our Q&A. I think a couple of questions were submitted in advance, but anyone else, please feel free to put them in the chat. A lot of information covered in a short period of time. So please, anything you have, feel free to share. And Adina, take it from here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that informative and really thought-provoking presentation. There are a few questions that have been sent in advance, so I'll share them now and looking forward to your answers. The first one is, how can music be used to mitigate the psychological and physiological effects of stress, especially given the context of the current socio-political climate? You're
Excuse
muted.
me. I
That's okay.
apologize. There are different neurological pathways in which um, people can benefit empirically from engaging with music. A lot of them relate to combining mental thoughts and physical activities. Dancing is probably the biggest one. So, dancing encourages bilateral stimulation, which allows the brain to process information more effectively. That is one that I think is underutilized. And because my talk focused on music specifically, I didn't really get at that one. But that idea has been substantiated over time, whether through recent scientific developments or at different points in our history, where many cultures don't have separate words for music and dance. And these things are seen as consonant with each other. Drummers learn how to dance, and dancers learn how to drum. So that way they can more collectively create music. It's not me singing at you, it is us creating a kind of symphony amongst each other, which is one concrete way. And additionally, certain pieces of what I said and kind of sadly rushed through towards the end. I think the Resonance RX app is a promising development. It is one that is expanding its services, but it uses artificial intelligence technology to speak to, people's subconscious needs, specifically as they are, going through diseases, as they are experiencing diseases that progressively impair their memory. There are special ways to heighten memories through music because these are processed in different ways. And specifically at a young age, songs that you deeply connect with are imprinted in certain ways on your consciousness. I think a final one is one that I wasn't able to include. I like to speak with authority on certain things, but this is one that's interesting. I can't um, succinctly explain it. However, it is one to look into as a kind of breadcrumb. But there are strategies in victims of strokes where they aren't able to speak, but kind of like how I said, language is also an aspect of melody. So they can speak through song. They can't in a conversational way communicate, but they can, sing in a more melodic manner.
Thank you. Next question. If the sound of music is based on perception, as so many other experiences are, as well, do you ever find that it creates divide between clinician and client rather than cohesion? And if so, how does one bridge that difference in perception, or is it even necessary to do so? In brief, can we agree to disagree?
Um, I think it depends on the purpose for which you're using it. If, and I'm speaking specifically in a clinical context, not necessarily an interpersonal context. So, as a clinician, whether I'm working with children who've been abused or adults I think it's an opportunity to, within a few minutes, communicate an idea. All right, you are very sad. And this song, I Feel, communicates it. Why? Why does this resonate with you? Is it simply the sonics? Is it the lyrics? Where do you go inside of yourself? Does it speak to your entire self? Or maybe the piece of you that manages your different parts? Does it speak to the inner child in you who might have been neglected? But, this song comforts you. It gives you an idea of a warm hug from your mother, something to that effect. So if I'm talking about, comparing and contrasting different musical tastes, flavors, profiles, that's one context. And that could be one where music can be used to agree to disagree. But if I'm asking someone simply, what does this evoke within you? It'd be bad for business if I told people I disagreed with how they felt.
What you just illustrated, I think, is, am I muted? Okay, I'm sorry. It's clear in your illustration here just how much rich information you have access to when you're talking about how music touches a client and where they go and all of what you just shared, but just how rich that is and how much you have access to a material that they may not have otherwise been able to articulate. And that's a
Yeah,
great example.
thank you. I appreciate it. And, I like to state my biases out loud. I'm a lyrics guy personally. Beats somewhere in there, but it's like I'm a lyrics guy for sure.
Me too, actually. Any other questions from the audience? I know that people are kind of sitting with this and giving thought, processing it. Would like to hear from you.
I'll give another minute or two in case people are typing. So if I'm cutting you off, don't be shy. Keep typing and we'll get to
Yes.
it. But if there aren't any further questions, Alex, I just want to thank you again for your wonderful presentation, sharing your time and expertise. As we were able to discuss a little earlier, this is different than things that we've had in the past, but I think really relevant. You touched on autoimmune and rheumatic illness, which so many of us interact with daily. And that's really powerful. I know some of us are just starting to explore this element of care for our patients. So we really appreciate it. Everyone, thank you for being here this afternoon. Happy Social Work Month once again to all of you. And again, please take a few minutes to complete our program evaluation. Nadia shared it in the chat box. Your feedback is really important. We really value your thoughts and opinions, and we want to make sure that we are programming relevant material for you all. So please complete that when you have a chance. Alex, thank you again. We'll speak more in the future and have a great afternoon, all of you. Thank you.
Thank you.